The town of Oak Creek, Arizona, in the summer of 1954, was a place that smelled of dry sagebrush, burnt gasoline, and the metallic tang of an approaching thunderstorm that never quite broke. It was a town that had grown too small for the ambition of its leaders and too large for the patience of its people. The local train station was the heartbeat of the valley, a place where the cacophony of modern commerce collided with the slow, rhythmic breathing of a disappearing world. There were men in suits pacing with pocket watches, mothers shielding children from the soot, and laborers hauling trunks that held more history than their bank accounts would ever reflect. Amidst this frantic choreography of movement, Arthur Penhaligon sat on a weathered pine bench. He didn't fit the frantic tempo of the station. He was a man composed of straight lines and sharp angles, wearing a service jacket that had been patched at the elbows and a cap that bore the faded insignia of the Pacific Theater. He didn't fidget. He didn't check the time. He simply occupied his space with a quiet, terrifying stillness, the kind of stillness that only belongs to men who have learned exactly what it takes to survive when the world is actively trying to erase them. Then the air shifted. The crowd felt it before they saw it. Sheriff Elias Thorne walked onto the platform, his boots clicking against the wood like a metronome set to a hostile rhythm. Thorne was a man of official courtesy, the kind that hides a razor behind a smile. He was 6 feet of starched khaki and vanity, a man who believed that authority was something you extracted from others through the sheer force of your presence. He didn't just walk, he claimed the atmosphere. Thorne stopped in front of Arthur. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his shadow falling long and heavy over the veteran's lap. "This platform is for passengers, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Not for loitering. You're making the ticket holders nervous." Arthur didn't look up. He stared at his own worn boots. "I'm waiting for the evening train, Sheriff." "The evening train doesn't arrive for 3 hours," Thorne retorted, his gaze sweeping the crowd to ensure he had an audience. "And you're blocking the flow of business. Move along, or I'll find a reason to make sure you spend the night in a cell." The platform went silent. A woman pulling a suitcase stopped. A merchant paused in the doorway. They all knew the truth. There was no rule against sitting, no ordinance being broken. But the sheriff had decided that today, Arthur Penhaligon was invisible, and he was using the weight of his badge to ensure the rest of the town agreed. The crowd began to look away, the universal signal of a society deciding that someone else's humiliation was the price of their own convenience. Across the platform, leaning against a stack of wooden crates, was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the Arizona landscape itself. John Wayne had been watching the scene for 10 minutes. He wasn't there to play the hero. He was just a traveler waiting for a connection, nursing a cigarette and observing the world with the weary eyes of a man who had seen enough human vanity to last a lifetime. Wayne didn't move with a flourish. He moved like a shadow that had finally decided to step into the light. He was 47 years old, his shoulders wide, his stride heavy and deliberate. He didn't look like a movie star. He looked like a man who knew exactly how much space he was entitled to and had no intention of yielding an inch of it. He stepped into the gap between the sheriff and the veteran. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply planted his feet and looked down at the sheriff with a steady, unblinking intensity that made the surrounding noise of the station seem to evaporate. "Problem here." Wayne's voice was like gravel shifting under a heavy boot. It was the voice of a man who didn't need to prove he was the toughest in the room because the room already knew. Thorne stiffened. He recognized the man, of course, but for a moment his ego pushed back. "Stay out of this, mister. This is county business." Wayne didn't flinch. He leaned in just enough to close the distance. "I don't see any business," Wayne said softly. "I see a man sitting on a bench, and I see a bully wearing a uniform he hasn't earned." For 3 seconds, the world stopped. In those 3 seconds, the sheriff realized that the atmosphere he had spent years crafting, that aura of untouchable authority, had been dismantled by a single, calm gaze. Thorne's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the crowd, expecting them to side with the badge, but he saw only stone-faced silence. He looked at Wayne, who hadn't even blinked. The realization hit the sheriff like a physical blow. His power was a performance, and the curtain had just been pulled back. Wayne turned his back on the sheriff, effectively dismissing him from the conversation. He looked at Arthur, who was staring up at him with a mixture of confusion and guarded pride. "You served?" Wayne asked, nodding toward the faded cap. "Okinawa," Arthur said, his voice raspy from disuse. "And later, the Chosun Reservoir. It gets cold, Mr. Wayne. Colder than you can imagine. You don't realize how much of yourself you leave behind in the ice until you're back home and you feel like a ghost." The story hung in the air, the brutal, frozen reality of a conflict that the rest of the world wanted to forget. Arthur spoke of the silence that followed the war. The way men who had held the line against entire divisions were expected to come home and sell insurance or stack lumber without a single question asked about the nightmares they carried. He spoke of the burden of quiet, the way veterans were treated like relics, honored in speeches on one day and shoved off benches on the next. Wayne listened. He didn't interrupt with platitudes. He understood the language of the quiet man better than anyone. He had spent his life playing characters who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. But standing there, he saw that the real thing, the actual weight, was far heavier than anything a prop department could construct.
"My friend," Wayne said, his tone shifting from confrontational to profoundly respectful. "A man who has faced the ice of the Chosen doesn't need to apologize for sitting on a bench." In that moment, the gap between the legend and the veteran closed. They were just 2 men recognizing the scars on each other's souls. The crowd began to stir again, but the energy had shifted. The sheriff was a distant, irrelevant figure, fading into the background of a story that no longer included him. Word of the incident moved through Oak Creek with the speed of a rumor in a small town. By the next morning, the sheriff's humiliation was the talk of every diner and barbershop. It wasn't the violence that mattered. It was the fact that someone had seen the injustice and, with nothing more than a sentence, rendered the oppressor powerless. The dynamics of the town changed. Thorne, for the first time in his career, felt the eyes of the people, not with fear, but with scrutiny. He started finding other routes to his patrol. He stopped enforcing his soft power because he knew that the illusion of his total authority had been shattered. Arthur, meanwhile, started being greeted by name. The merchant who had looked away now tipped his hat. The mother who had shielded her child now offered a nod of respect. This is what people get wrong about John Wayne. They analyze his films, his politics, and his persona as if he were a monument to be debated. They miss the quiet thing. They miss the fact that he understood that true power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about having the courage to see the people everyone else has decided not to see. We live in a world that thrives on noise. We are constantly told to look at the people at the top, the people with the microphones, the people with the platforms. But the measure of a man isn't what he does when the cameras are rolling or when the public is watching. It's what he does when he's waiting for a train and sees someone being treated as less than human. Dignity is a fragile thing. It requires witnesses. When you stand up for the person the world wants to ignore, you aren't just doing them a favor. You are reinforcing the foundation of a society worth living in. As the sun began to dip behind the mesas of Arizona, casting long, golden shadows across the train station, Arthur Penhaligon remained on his bench. He wasn't a hero in a movie. He was just a man. But he was a man who had been seen. The lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1954. We will all encounter our own Sheriff Thorns, people who try to make us feel small, or who try to make others feel invisible. The question isn't whether you have the power to stop them. The question is whether you have the courage to sit down across from them and simply be there. The measure of a man is found in the moments nobody photographs. It's found in the quiet choices to be decent when being cynical would be easier. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that the measure of a man is found in his character and his willingness to stand up for the silent, then drop a comment below. Let's keep these stories of honor and quiet dignity alive. And if you aren't subscribed yet, hit that button. We share stories here for those who understand that being a legend isn't about the noise, but about the quiet impact you leave behind. Thank you for listening.